I'm Eva, 34, and I built a successful consulting firm from scratch while spending decades as my younger sister's safety net. For years, I dropped everything to bail Isabelle out financially, emotionally, practically, whenever she needed rescuing. But when she called me the embarrassment of the family in front of a room full of strangers at her Navy SEAL husband's promotion ceremony, I decided I was done being taken for granted. Have you ever been publicly humiliated by someone you'd sacrificed everything for? If so, share your story below. You're definitely not alone. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to walk away from someone who didn't value you, smash that like button and subscribe for more real stories about finding your backbone and demanding the respect you deserve. What happened at the next military ceremony? Let's just say karma has perfect timing. I was 12 when Isabelle came home from her first day of middle school crying because the older kids had cornered her by the lockers. I found her in our shared bedroom, face buried in her pillow, shoulders shaking. Without hesitation, I marched back to school the next morning and positioned myself near her locker between classes. When the same group approached, I stepped forward. "You have a problem with my sister?" The ringleader, a boy 2 grades ahead, looked me up and down and walked away. That's how it always was with us. I protected her, and she let me. Growing up, I was the one who stayed up late helping Isabelle with algebra when she couldn't grasp the concepts. I was the one who talked our parents out of grounding her when she came home past curfew junior year. When she got her heart broken by her first serious boyfriend, I drove 4 hours to bring her ice cream and tissues, sitting on her dorm room floor while she processed the pain. It never occurred to me to keep score. She was my little sister, and looking out for her felt as natural as breathing. The pattern continued well into our 20s. Isabelle had a gift for finding herself in situations that required rescue, financial emergencies, career missteps, relationship drama. I'd get the tearful phone call, and I'd drop everything to help. When she couldn't make rent during her struggling artist phase, I covered it for 3 months without making her feel guilty. When she totaled her car and had no savings for a replacement, I co-signed the loan. When she needed someone to help her move across the country for a fresh start, I took time off work and drove the U-Haul myself. Isabelle had this way of accepting help that made you feel like you were doing something important. She'd throw her arms around me and say, "I don't know what I'd do without you," and I'd feel this warm satisfaction that I'd been useful, that I'd made a difference in her life. It wasn't until much later that I realized how rarely she asked about my life in return. Our conversations always seemed to circle back to her challenges, her dreams, her latest crisis or triumph. When Isabelle met Mark at a military charity event, everything about her seemed to brighten. She called me that first night, practically vibrating with excitement through the phone. "He's different," she said. "Strong, focused, dedicated. He knows what he wants." Mark was a Navy SEAL, 6 years into his career, and the intensity that drew Isabelle to him was apparent from the moment I met him. He had this quiet confidence, the kind that comes from knowing you can handle whatever life throws at you. I supported their relationship from the beginning. When Mark was deployed for 6 months early in their dating, I sent Isabelle care packages and listened to her worry about the distance. When they got engaged, I helped plan the engagement party, coordinating with Mark's military friends who were scattered across different bases. I even took vacation time to attend Mark's training graduation ceremony, watching Isabelle beam with pride as he received his commendations. The wedding was beautiful, a military ceremony complete with the sword arch and Isabelle in a dress that made her look like she'd stepped out of a fairy tale. I was her maid of honor, naturally, and I spent weeks helping her coordinate details, from arranging flowers to managing the guest list that included officers and their spouses from multiple bases. Watching her walk down the aisle, I felt the same protective satisfaction I'd always felt when Isabelle got something she really wanted. In our family, giving came naturally to me. Maybe it was being the older sister, or maybe it was just my nature, but I found satisfaction in being the person others could count on. My parents had always praised me for being responsible, reliable, the one who held things together. Isabelle got the praise for being creative, spontaneous, the one who brought lightness to every room. We each had our role, and it seemed to work. But even in those early days of Isabelle's marriage, I started to notice something. The thank you notes I used to receive for my help became less frequent. The long conversations where she'd ask about my job, my dating life, my own goals, those became shorter, more perfunctory. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as the natural result of her being newly married and building a life with Mark. Everyone knows that first year of marriage requires all your attention. Looking back, I can see the signs were there from the beginning. Isabelle had always been a little self-centered. Most people are when they're young and figuring out their place in the world. But there was something about her new life with Mark, about being connected to the military community, that seemed to amplify this tendency. She started using phrases like, military families understand sacrifice and civilians don't really get it, as if she'd been born into this world instead of married into it 2 months earlier. Still, when she called asking for help with their first apartment, I showed up with cleaning supplies and spent the weekend painting their bedroom. When Mark's parents visited and Isabelle panicked about hosting, I brought groceries and helped her cook a dinner that impressed them. When they needed references for their security clearances, I wrote glowing letters about both of them, emphasizing Isabelle's character and reliability. It wasn't that I expected constant gratitude, family helps family, and that's just how it works. But I was starting to sense that Isabelle saw my help less as generosity and more as something she was entitled to, something that was simply part of my function in her life. The realization was uncomfortable, so I pushed it aside. She was happy, Mark was good for her, and their future looked bright. That was what mattered, or at least that's what I told myself as I continued to show up, continued to help, continued to be the sister she could always count on, whether she acknowledged it or not. The shift started so gradually that I almost missed it. Isabelle's voice took on a different quality during our phone calls, more confident, but also more dismissive. She'd always been prone to enthusiasm about whatever phase of life she was in, but now there was an edge to it, as if her new status as a military spouse had given her some special insight into how the world worked. You wouldn't understand, she started saying when I'd offer advice about her challenges with Mark's deployment schedule or the social dynamics on base. It's a military thing. As if my perspective, my decades of knowing her better than anyone else, had suddenly become irrelevant because I hadn't married someone in uniform. The first real warning sign came at a barbecue Mark's unit threw for families. Isabelle introduced me to a group of other wives with words that made me pause. This is my sister. She's not married yet, still figuring things out. The qualifier felt unnecessary, almost apologetic, as if my single status was something that required explanation or excuse. When one of the women asked what I did for work, Isabelle jumped in before I could answer. She has a little consulting business. Nothing too exciting. Little consulting business. I'd been running my own firm for 3 years, with a client list that included 2 Fortune 500 companies. I let it slide that day, telling myself Isabelle was nervous about fitting in with a new group of people, that she'd misspoken or I'd misheard the tone. But similar moments kept happening. At Mark's birthday party, when someone complimented the decorations I'd helped arrange, Isabelle smiled and said, I had to do most of it myself. You know how it is when you're the organized one in the family. At their housewarming, she introduced me to Mark's commanding officer with a laugh. My sister always volunteers to help with these things. She doesn't have much else going on. Each comment was small enough to ignore individually, but together they formed a pattern I couldn't unsee. Isabelle was repositioning herself as the accomplished sister, the one with the impressive life, while casting me as someone who was helpful but ultimately less significant. It was as if she decided that being a military spouse automatically elevated her status, and that everyone else, including me, needed to be understood in relation to that identity. The guest list for Mark's promotion ceremony should have been my clearest warning. Isabelle called 2 weeks before the event, excitement bubbling through the phone. It's going to be such a big deal, she said. All the senior officers will be there, plus their wives. Mark's parents are flying in, and we're having this whole reception afterward. She paused, and I waited for the invitation that didn't come. I wish we could invite everyone we wanted, but you know how these things are, very exclusive guest list. I wasn't hurt so much as confused. I'd been to Mark's previous ceremonies, had driven hours to attend his graduations and commendations. Isabelle had always wanted me there before, had even specifically asked me to take time off work for some of them. Of course, I said. I understand these military events have protocols. But 2 days later, I saw Isabelle's social media posts about the celebration planning, and she was tagging cousins I barely spoke to, college friends who lived across the country, even Mark's buddy's girlfriend who she'd met exactly once. The guest list wasn't about protocol or space limitations. It was about the image Isabelle wanted to project, and apparently I didn't fit that image anymore. Mark called me himself 3 days before the ceremony. Isabelle mentioned you might not be able to make it to the promotion, he said, and I could hear the confusion in his voice. I hope that's not true. It would mean a lot to have you there. I realized Isabelle hadn't told him about the guest list conversation at all. She'd simply decided I shouldn't be there and figured she'd deal with any questions later. I'll be there, I told Mark, and I meant it. Not because I was trying to force my way into an event where I wasn't wanted, but because Mark had always treated me with genuine respect and appreciation. If he wanted me there, I would show up for him, regardless of Isabelle's new attitude. The morning of the ceremony, I chose my outfit carefully, professional but not attention-seeking, appropriate for a military event. I arrived early and found my seat in the section designated for family and close friends. Isabelle spotted me immediately, and the flash of irritation that crossed her face confirmed what I already knew. She hadn't expected me to come, despite Mark's invitation. She made her way over during the pre-ceremony reception, her smile bright and fake. "You made it," she said, as if my presence was a pleasant surprise rather than something we'd discussed multiple times. "How nice." Her voice carried that particular tone she'd developed lately, the one that sounded polite on the surface, but had sharp edges underneath. I watched her work the room that afternoon, moving between groups of officers and their spouses with practiced ease. She'd learned the language of military social events quickly, the right questions to ask, the appropriate responses to give, the subtle ways to signal status and belonging. It was impressive, actually, how completely she'd absorbed this new identity. But watching her operate, I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd decided being Isabelle the military spouse required diminishing everyone else in her orbit, starting with me. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Mark looked proud and dignified as he received his new rank, and the whole event had that polished formality that military organizations do so well. I found myself genuinely moved watching him take his oath, knowing how hard he'd worked for this moment and what it meant for his career. During the reception that followed, I stayed near the periphery, making polite conversation with the other guests and trying to be supportive without getting in Isabelle's way. She was clearly in her element, charming the senior officers' wives and making sure everyone knew she was the perfect military spouse. I was content to observe, to let her have her moment. That's when I heard my name. "Oh, that's my sister," Isabelle was saying to a small cluster of guests, 2 couples I didn't recognize and an older woman wearing the kind of understated jewelry that signals real money. They were all turned slightly in my direction, and Isabelle was gesturing toward me with a champagne flute in her hand. "She's the embarrassment of the family." The words hit me like cold water. I froze, my drink halfway to my lips, as Isabelle continued talking and laughing with the group. A few of the guests glanced at me uncertainly, clearly uncomfortable with what they'd just heard, but Isabelle seemed oblivious to their reaction. She was smiling that bright, social smile, the one she used when she was performing confidence. Isabelle always was the dramatic one, the older woman said diplomatically, clearly trying to redirect the conversation. But Isabelle wasn't finished. "No, I'm serious," she said, her laugh getting sharper. Look at her just standing there by herself. Never married, still trying to figure out what she wants to do with her life. I keep telling her she needs to get it together, but... She shrugged as if my failure to meet her standards was both puzzling and slightly embarrassing for everyone involved. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, processing what I'd just heard. This wasn't a slip of the tongue or a joke that came out wrong. This was Isabelle's actual opinion of me, delivered to strangers at her husband's promotion ceremony. Years of support, of showing up, of being the reliable sister who could always be counted on, all of it reduced to a punchline about family embarrassment. The room around me continued buzzing with conversation, but everything felt muffled, like I was underwater. I watched Isabelle continue chatting with the group, animated and confident, as if she hadn't just publicly humiliated the person who'd spent decades putting her needs first. She caught my eye for a brief moment and gave me a little wave, completely oblivious to what she'd just done, or maybe just completely uncaring. I didn't storm out. I didn't make a scene. I didn't march over and confront her in front of her new friends. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was, finished my drink, and let the full weight of the moment settle over me. This wasn't the first time Isabelle had dismissed or diminished me in recent months. It was just the most public, the most cruel, and the most impossible to explain away. One of the couples from Isabelle's group approached me a few minutes later. The woman looked genuinely uncomfortable. "I hope you don't mind me saying," she said quietly, but that comment was completely uncalled for. "I don't know what's gotten into her." Her husband nodded agreement, and their obvious discomfort with Isabelle's behavior was almost worse than the original insult. Strangers felt compelled to apologize for my own sister's cruelty. "Thank you," I managed, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. "That's very kind." But their kindness, while appreciated, couldn't undo what I'd just experienced. Isabelle hadn't just made a thoughtless comment. She'd revealed something fundamental about how she now saw me, how she'd been seeing me, probably for months. I was no longer her supportive older sister. I was a liability, someone whose mere existence somehow reflected poorly on the image she was trying to project. I stayed for the rest of the ceremony because leaving would have felt like giving Isabelle exactly what she wanted, confirmation that I was indeed an embarrassment, someone who couldn't handle social situations or military protocol. But inside, something had shifted permanently. The unconditional loyalty I'd felt toward Isabelle, the automatic willingness to drop everything and help her, the assumption that despite her flaws we were fundamentally on the same team, all of that crystallized into something much colder and more calculating. When Mark's commanding officer began the closing remarks, I was already mentally planning my exit strategy. Not just from the ceremony, but from the entire dynamic that had brought me to this moment. Isabelle wanted to rewrite the family narrative with herself as the successful sister and me as the embarrassment? Fine. But she was about to learn what life looked like without a safety net she'd taken for granted for 30 years. I stepped outside during the final break in the ceremony, phone in hand, pretending to check messages while I processed what had just happened. The late afternoon air was crisp, and I found myself grateful for the physical distance from the reception room, from Isabelle's performance, from the pitying looks of strangers who'd witnessed my public humiliation. "Mind if I join you?" The voice belonged to Eva Chin, a woman I'd met earlier, the wife of one of Mark's fellow officers. She'd been in the group that had overheard Isabelle's comment, and her expression had made it clear she found the whole thing distasteful. "Please," I said, gesturing to the space beside me on the stone wall where I'd perched. Eva didn't waste time on small talk. "That was uncalled for," she said simply. "What she said in there, that was cruel and inappropriate, and I wanted you to know that everyone who heard it thought so." Her directness was oddly comforting. In the past, when Isabelle had made smaller digs or dismissive comments, I'd found myself questioning whether I was being too sensitive, whether I was reading too much into innocent remarks. But there was no ambiguity about what had just happened, and having someone else acknowledge that felt validating. "Thank you for saying that," I replied. "It's been building for a while, actually." This was just the most public example. Eva nodded knowingly. "Military spouse culture can be intense," she said. "Some women get so caught up in the status and hierarchy that they forget basic human decency. I've seen it happen before, people who were perfectly nice before their husband's career took off suddenly acting like they're royalty." As we talked, I found myself replaying not just today's incident, but months of smaller moments that had led to this point. The casual dismissals of my career achievements. The way Isabelle had started introducing me with qualifiers that positioned her as the successful sister and me as the one still figuring things out. The selective invitations to events, the assumption that I would always be available to help while she rarely asked about my own life or needs. "The thing is," I said, surprising myself by speaking the thought out loud, "I've been supporting her since we were kids. Financially, emotionally, practically, whenever she needed something, I was there." And somewhere along the way, she stopped seeing that as generosity and started seeing it as evidence that her life was more important than mine. Eva was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" It was a simple question, but it cut right to the heart of what I'd been avoiding. For years, I'd maintained the relationship by absorbing Isabelle's increasing selfishness, by making excuses for her behavior, by continuing to show up and offer support even as she offered less and less in return. I'd told myself that was what family meant: unconditional love, unconditional support, regardless of how you were treated. But sitting there in the afternoon sunlight, I realized that what I'd been calling family loyalty had actually become something much less healthy. I'd been enabling Isabelle's worst impulses by refusing to set boundaries, by accepting treatment I would never tolerate from a friend or colleague. I'd been so committed to being the good sister that I'd forgotten I deserved to be treated with basic respect. "I'm going to step back," I said, and the words felt both scary and liberating. Not out of spite, but because this dynamic isn't working anymore. She wants to see me as an embarrassment? Fine. She can figure out what life looks like without someone she's embarrassed by constantly bailing her out. The decision felt both sudden and inevitable. I'd been moving toward this moment for months without realizing it, each small slight and dismissal adding weight to a scale that had finally tipped. This afternoon's humiliation was just the catalyst that forced me to acknowledge what I'd been avoiding. The relationship had become fundamentally unbalanced and unhealthy, and I was the only one with the power to change that. When we returned to the reception, I made my polite goodbyes to Mark and the other guests I'd spoken with throughout the day. Isabelle was busy holding court with another group of officers' wives, and I didn't interrupt. There would be time for conversations later, but this wasn't the moment for confrontation or explanation. Driving home that evening, I felt a strange combination of sadness and relief. Sadness for the relationship Isabelle and I had once had, for the closeness we'd shared when we were younger, for the sister who used to value my presence in her life. But relief too, relief at finally acknowledging the reality of what our relationship had become, relief at giving myself permission to step away from a dynamic that had become toxic. I'd spent so many years defining myself through my usefulness to Isabelle that I'd forgotten what it felt like to simply exist without constantly considering her needs first. Tonight, for the first time in decades, I was going to go home and think about what I wanted, what I needed, what would make me happy, without filtering every decision through the lens of how it might affect my sister or what kind of help she might require next. The sister who had once protected Isabelle from middle school bullies was about to learn how to protect herself from a different kind of hurt, the kind that comes from people who claim to love you but show it by making you smaller. The silence started immediately. No call that night to recap the ceremony, no text the next day asking if I'd gotten home safely. For years, post-event conversations had been our ritual. Isabelle would call to dissect every moment, analyze every interaction, and usually thank me for whatever support I'd provided. The absence of that call told me she either genuinely didn't understand what she'd done wrong, or she was waiting for me to reach out first, to apologize for some imagined transgression. I didn't call. Instead, I focused on my own work with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. Without the constant background hum of Isabelle's latest crisis or celebration requiring my attention, I found myself with mental energy I'd forgotten I had. I took on a new client project that had been sitting in my inbox for weeks. I scheduled dinners with friends I'd been meaning to see. I signed up for a painting class I'd been considering for over a year. The first real test came 2 weeks later when Isabelle called about her car breaking down. In the past, this would have been a 40-minute conversation followed by me either lending her money for repairs or driving to wherever she was stranded to help figure out a solution. This time, I listened to her explanation of the problem and offered the same advice I would give any casual acquaintance. That sounds really frustrating. I hope you're able to get it sorted out. The pause on the other end of the line stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. That's it? Isabelle finally asked. You're not going to ask if I need anything? Do you need anything? I asked, though my tone made it clear I was asking out of politeness rather than genuine offer to help. Well, I thought maybe you could look at it, or at least help me figure out which mechanic to call. You know I don't understand car stuff. There are several highly rated auto shops near you, I said. I'm sure any of them would be happy to help. This conversation set the pattern for the next several months. Isabelle would call with various requests, help with a dinner party she was planning, advice on a disagreement she was having with Mark, someone to listen while she complained about the politics among the military wives on base. Each time, I offered generic sympathy but no practical assistance. I wasn't rude or hostile, I was simply unavailable in the way I'd always been available before. The shift was clearly confusing for her. Isabelle had grown accustomed to my unconditional support, and she seemed genuinely puzzled by my new boundaries. Her requests became more direct, then more pleading. I really need your help with this, she'd say, or you're the only person I can talk to about this stuff. When emotional appeals didn't work, she tried guilt. I thought family was supposed to be there for each other. Family should be there for each other, I agreed. That's exactly right. The subtext was clear, but Isabelle wasn't ready to examine her own role in our changing dynamic. Instead, she seemed to assume this was some kind of temporary mood, a phase I was going through that would eventually pass if she just waited it out. Meanwhile, my own life was expanding in ways that surprised me. Without Isabelle's constant needs taking up space in my schedule and mental bandwidth, I found myself saying yes to opportunities one might have declined before. When a colleague invited me to speak at an industry conference, I didn't immediately think about whether the timing would conflict with something Isabelle might need. When a friend suggested a weekend trip that would require planning and commitment, I didn't hesitate to book it. The professional recognition was particularly satisfying. The consulting work I'd been building for years was finally getting the attention it deserved, partly because I was able to give it my full focus. I landed 2 major contracts in 3 months, both with companies that valued my expertise and treated me with the kind of professional respect that had been missing from my personal relationships. Isabelle noticed the change during one of our increasingly brief phone calls. You seem different lately, she said, and there was something almost accusatory in her tone. More distant. Are you upset with me about something? The question was so breathtakingly oblivious that I almost laughed. I'm not upset, I said. I'm just busy with my own life. But we barely talk anymore. It's like you don't care what's happening with Mark and me, or the house renovations, or any of the stuff that's going on. I hope everything is going well for you both, I said, and I meant it. I genuinely wanted Isabelle to be happy and successful. I just no longer felt responsible for ensuring that happiness or success came at my own expense. The conversation ended awkwardly, with Isabelle clearly frustrated by my refusal to return to our old pattern. But I felt something I hadn't experienced in years when dealing with my sister, peace. For the first time in decades, I was living my life on my own terms, making decisions based on what I wanted rather than what Isabelle needed, and the freedom was intoxicating. I was beginning to understand that the person Isabelle had dismissed as the family embarrassment was actually someone worth knowing, someone with her own talents, ambitions, and value that existed independently of her usefulness to others. It had taken 30 years and a public humiliation to figure that out, but I was finally learning to see myself clearly. Without my constant safety net, Isabelle's life began showing cracks that had been hidden by my consistent support. The first sign came when she called in November, 6 months after Mark's promotion ceremony, her voice tight with stress. She'd volunteered to organize the unit's holiday party, a significant social event that could impact Mark's reputation, and she was overwhelmed by the logistics. I thought it would be simple, she said, but there are dietary restrictions and seating charts and budget approvals, and I have no idea what I'm doing. The other wives keep asking me questions I can't answer. In the past, I would have dropped everything to help her create spreadsheets, research catering options, and draft contingency plans. This time, I offered sympathy but no solutions. That sounds really challenging, I said. I'm sure you'll figure it out. The party, according to mutual family friends who attended, was a disaster. The food ran out early, The decorations looked hastily assembled, and several senior officers' dietary needs were ignored entirely. Isabelle had always been good at the creative, big-picture aspects of event planning, but she'd relied on me to handle the detailed execution that actually made events successful. More problems followed. Mark's parents visited for Christmas, and Isabelle miscalculated both the grocery budget and the timing for their elaborate meal plans. She'd grown accustomed to having me show up with extra dishes and backup plans whenever her entertaining ambitions exceeded her practical skills. This time, Mark's mother ended up cooking most of Christmas dinner, while Isabelle had what family members diplomatically described as a stress reaction. The financial mistakes were harder to hide. Isabelle had always been impulsive with money, but I'd been there to help her calculate costs, research purchases, and occasionally provide emergency funds when her optimism exceeded her budget. Now, without that backup, several decisions came back to haunt her. The expensive furniture she'd bought for their newly renovated living room arrived damaged, and she discovered too late that she hadn't purchased adequate insurance. The weekend getaway she'd planned for Mark's birthday cost twice what she'd budgeted, and she had to ask Mark's parents for a loan to cover their credit card payment. Meanwhile, my own professional reputation continued growing. The conference presentation I'd given in the fall had led to speaking invitations at 2 more events, and industry publications were starting to quote my expertise. A technology company invited me to join their advisory board, recognizing knowledge I'd been developing for years, but had never had time to fully leverage while managing Isabelle's various crises. The contrast wasn't lost on our family. At Thanksgiving dinner, our aunt mentioned seeing my name in a business magazine article about innovative consulting practices. "I had no idea you were doing such impressive work," she said. "You always seemed so busy helping Isabelle with things that I assumed your own career was more of a side project." Isabelle's expression during that conversation was complicated, part pride in my success, part confusion about how it had happened without her knowledge, and part something that looked like resentment that I was receiving recognition for accomplishments she'd consistently minimized. "I always knew she was smart," Isabelle said to the table, "but she's not usually very good at the business side of things. I'm surprised she's been so successful." The comment revealed how fundamentally she misunderstood both my capabilities and my previous choices. I hadn't been bad at business. I'd been too busy managing her life to fully focus on my own. The little consulting business she dismissed at Mark's barbecue had been limited not by my abilities, but by how much time and energy I devoted to being her unpaid life manager. As winter progressed, Isabelle's attempts to reconnect became more frequent and more desperate. She'd send photos from our childhood with captions like, "Remember when we were inseparable?" She'd forward funny memes with messages like, "This made me think of you. I miss talking every day." When subtle approaches didn't work, she tried direct appeals. "I feel like we're growing apart, and I don't understand why. Can we talk about what's wrong?" But nothing was wrong exactly. I wasn't angry anymore, wasn't hurt in the acute way I'd been after the promotion ceremony. I'd simply stopped prioritizing her needs above my own well-being, stopped accepting treatment I wouldn't tolerate from anyone else, stopped defining my worth through my usefulness to someone who'd made it clear she saw that usefulness as evidence of my lesser status. The Isabelle who'd called me the family embarrassment had been telling the truth about how she saw me. My mistake had been continuing to invest in a relationship with someone who held such a fundamentally disrespectful view of who I was. Now that I'd stepped back from that investment, I was discovering who I could become when I believed in my own value as much as I'd always believed in hers. By the time spring arrived, I was living a life I barely recognized, fuller, more confident, more aligned with my actual priorities and abilities. The sister who'd once defined herself through her willingness to rescue Isabelle had learned something much more valuable: how to rescue herself. Spring brought Mark's next major ceremony, his selection for a specialized training program that would advance his career significantly. Unlike the promotion ceremony 8 months earlier, this time Isabelle called me directly with the invitation. Her voice was carefully casual, but I could hear the underlying nervousness. "It's going to be a smaller event," she said, "just close family and friends. Mark specifically asked me to make sure you were invited." The implication was clear: this invitation was coming from Mark, not from her. She was making sure I understood the hierarchy while still extending what felt like an olive branch. I accepted, partly because I genuinely respected Mark and wanted to support his achievement, and partly because I was curious to see how Isabelle would handle our interaction after months of my polite but distant responses to her various attempts at reconciliation. When I arrived at the venue, a smaller military facility than the previous ceremony, I was struck by how different I felt walking into the room. 8 months ago, I'd entered as Isabelle's supportive older sister, someone whose identity was largely defined by that relationship. Today, I walked in as someone who'd spent the better part of a year focusing on her own life and achievements, and the confidence that came with that shift was palpable. Isabelle greeted me with what appeared to be genuine warmth, though there was something performative about it, as if she was demonstrating to the other attendees what a loving sister looked like. "I'm so glad you could make it," she said, hugging me just a little too tightly, just a little too long. "We need to catch up properly after the ceremony." I returned her hug politely, but didn't commit to any post-ceremony conversations. I'd learned to be pleasant without being available, friendly without being vulnerable. If Isabelle wanted to rebuild our relationship, it would require more than a public display of sisterly affection at her husband's career milestone. The ceremony itself was beautiful and more intimate than the previous event. Mark's commanding officer spoke about the rigorous selection process and the significance of the training program Mark had been chosen for. Watching Mark accept this recognition, I felt genuinely proud of his achievements and happy for the opportunities ahead of him. My complicated feelings about Isabelle didn't extend to her husband, who had always treated me with consistent respect and appreciation. During the reception afterward, I found myself in conversations with several attendees who remembered me from previous military events. A few commented on seeing my name in industry publications or mentioned hearing about my recent speaking engagements. One officer's wife, someone I'd met briefly at a previous gathering, said, "I've been following your work since that article in Forbes. It's impressive how you've built such expertise in your field." The recognition felt good, but what felt even better was that it was recognition for my own achievements rather than my role as someone's helpful sister. I was being seen and valued for who I was independently, and that sense of individual identity was something I'd almost forgotten I was capable of experiencing. Isabelle drifted in and out of these conversations, and I could see her processing the fact that people knew me professionally, that I had accomplishments and a reputation that existed entirely separate from my relationship to her. There was something almost puzzled in her expression, as if she was trying to reconcile this version of me with the sister she'd dismissed as the family embarrassment. As the formal portion of the evening wound down, the commanding officer moved to the microphone for what appeared to be some closing remarks. I was gathering my things, preparing to say my polite goodbyes and head home, when I heard him speak words that stopped me cold. "Before we wrap up tonight's celebration," he said, "I want to take a moment to recognize someone who exemplifies the kind of courage and dedication that makes our military family stronger." The room quieted, and I assumed he was about to acknowledge another service member, or perhaps thank the host family. Instead, he continued, "Many of you may not know that we have a genuine hero among us tonight. Someone whose quick thinking and expert knowledge saved the life of one of our own." My heart started beating faster as I realized where this might be heading, but I told myself I was being presumptuous. There were dozens of people in the room. The commander could be talking about anyone. Last fall, during a family camping trip, Petty Officer Jensen's 8-year-old daughter went into anaphylactic shock from a bee sting in a remote area with no cell service. The closest hospital was over an hour away, and the child was losing consciousness. By pure chance, there was someone on that camping trip who had both the medical knowledge and the emergency supplies needed to stabilize a child in severe allergic distress until professional help could arrive. The room was completely silent now, and I felt several pairs of eyes turning toward me. My mind flashed back to that weekend in October, 6 months earlier, when I'd been camping with friends at a state park that happened to overlap with a military family's group outing. I'd heard the commotion from our campsite, panicked voices, someone shouting for help, and I'd grabbed my emergency medical kit and run toward the sound. The little girl, Jensen's daughter, had been playing near the creek when she'd disturbed a ground nest. multiple stings, and she'd gone into shock faster than anyone expected. Her parents were experienced military personnel, trained in basic first aid, but they'd never dealt with pediatric anaphylaxis in a wilderness setting. By the time I reached them, she was struggling to breathe, her airway closing, her pulse becoming thready. I'd administered the emergency epinephrine from my kit, established an airway, and coordinated the evacuation with the park rangers while keeping her stabilized. My consulting work had required wilderness first aid certification for some remote project sites, but more importantly, I'd maintained advanced emergency medical training since college. A skill set I'd developed after a climbing accident in my 20s had left me dependent on the expertise of others. I'd sworn then to never again be in a position where I couldn't help in a medical crisis. The commander's voice brought me back to the present moment. That person didn't hesitate, didn't wait for someone else to take charge, didn't worry about liability or protocol. She saw a child in crisis and used her knowledge and training to save a life. Petty Officer Jensen and his family will be forever grateful, as are all of us who understand how easily that story could have had a different ending. He paused, scanning the room until his eyes found mine. Please join me in recognizing someone whose actions embody the very best of what it means to serve others, even when you're not officially serving. Ladies and gentlemen, she's the hero who saved one of our own. The room erupted in applause, and I felt the blood drain from my face as everyone turned toward me. Through the crowd of people rising to their feet, clapping and smiling in my direction, I caught sight of Isabelle's expression. She was frozen, her face white with shock, her champagne glass suspended halfway to her lips, as if she'd been turned to stone mid-gesture. I stood slowly, acknowledging the recognition with a nod and a brief wave, but my eyes stayed locked on Isabelle's face. This was the sister she'd called the family embarrassment, the one who'd saved a child's life while she was busy managing seating charts and menu selections. The sister whose little consulting business required emergency medical certification and wilderness survival training. The sister whose supposedly simple lifestyle included skills that had literally meant the difference between life and death for a military family. The applause continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. When it finally died down and people began returning to their conversations, I remained standing, still processing what had just happened. Several attendees approached to shake my hand, to thank me, to ask about my medical training. Petty Officer Jensen himself, a man I'd only met briefly that day at the campsite, made his way through the crowd with tears in his eyes. I never got to properly thank you, he said, gripping my hand with both of his. Eva's doing great. She's learned to carry her own EpiPen now, and she knows what to watch for. But if you hadn't been there that day... He couldn't finish the sentence. I'm just glad I could help, I said, and I meant it. The recognition was nice, but what mattered was that an 8-year-old girl had gone home safe to her family that day. As the crowd around me began to disperse, I finally looked back toward where Isabelle had been standing. She was still there, but she was no longer frozen. Instead, she was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, part shock, part something that might have been shame, part what looked like dawning realization. For 8 months, I'd been stepping back from our relationship, focusing on my own life, letting her figure out how to manage without my constant support. I'd thought I was simply setting boundaries, protecting my own well-being, learning to value myself appropriately. But tonight, in front of a room full of people who mattered to Isabelle's social standing, it became clear that my retreat had revealed something she hadn't expected. I wasn't the family embarrassment she'd made me out to be. I was someone with genuine skills, real accomplishments, and the kind of character that earned respect from people she was desperately trying to impress. The sister she'd dismissed and diminished for months had just been publicly honored by her husband's commanding officer for heroism she'd never even known about. The life she'd characterized as simple and unremarkable included training and experiences that had equipped me to save a child's life in an emergency. The consulting work she'd minimized as nothing too exciting had given me skills that military personnel found valuable and impressive. I didn't approach Isabelle that evening. I didn't gloat or make pointed comments about the irony of the situation. I simply accepted the congratulations from the other guests, spoke briefly with a few people who wanted to know more about wilderness emergency response, and made my polite goodbyes. As I was leaving, I nodded to Isabelle across the room, not coldly, but not with the warm familiarity we'd once shared. Driving home that night, I realized that the recognition, while gratifying, wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was that I'd finally learned to see myself clearly, not as the family member whose value came from her usefulness to others, but as someone worthy of respect and recognition in her own right. Isabelle's public embarrassment of me 8 months earlier had ultimately been a gift, forcing me to step back and discover who I was when I wasn't constantly diminishing myself to make her shine brighter. The hero who'd saved one of their own had been there all along. She'd just been too busy taking care of everyone else to notice her own strength. The phone rang at 7:30 the next morning. Isabelle's name on the caller ID didn't surprise me. I'd been expecting this conversation since I'd seen her face at the ceremony the night before. What surprised me was how calm I felt as I answered. "Hi, Isabelle. We need to talk." Her voice was strained, none of the careful casualness she'd been using during our interactions over the past few months. "Can I come over?" "I'm about to leave for a client meeting," I said, which was true. "But we can talk now if you want." On the phone, she sounded incredulous. "After what happened last night, you don't think this deserves a real conversation?" I almost laughed at the assumption that I owed her a face-to-face meeting to process her reaction to discovering I wasn't who she thought I was. "Isabelle, what happened last night was a military officer recognizing something I did 6 months ago. I'm not sure why that requires a conversation between us. You saved a child's life." The words came out flat, as if she was still trying to process the information. "A military family's child. And you never told me. Why would I tell you?" The question wasn't meant to be cruel, but it was honest. "We barely talk anymore, and when we do, it's usually because you need something. This wasn't about you." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Isabelle spoke again, and her voice was smaller than I'd heard it in years. "Everyone at that ceremony knew you were someone important. They were talking about your work, your achievements, like you were this accomplished professional. And I didn't know any of it." "You didn't want to know any of it," I corrected gently. "For the past year, every time I tried to share something about my work or my life, you either changed the subject or found a way to minimize it. You decided I wasn't worth paying attention to, so you stopped paying attention." Another long pause. "I never said you weren't worth paying attention to, Isabelle." I kept my voice level matter of fact. "At Mark's promotion ceremony, you told a group of strangers that I was the embarrassment of the family. You introduced me to military spouses by saying I had a little consulting business and that I was still figuring out my life. You stopped inviting me to events that mattered to you, stopped asking about my work, stopped showing any interest in my life unless you needed something from it." She started to speak, then stopped. "I didn't mean you meant it," I said, not unkindly but firmly. "And that's okay. People are allowed to decide what's important to them and who deserves their attention. But I'm also allowed to decide that I don't want to keep trying to maintain a relationship with someone who sees me that way. But you're my sister." The words came out almost pleading. "We used to be close. We used to tell each other everything. We used to have a relationship where I supported you and you accepted that support," I said. "That worked when we were younger, but it stopped being healthy for me. When I tried to change the dynamic, you made it clear you weren't interested in a more balanced relationship. So I stepped back." I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, and I almost felt sorry for her. Isabelle was discovering that the sister she'd taken for granted, the one she'd dismissed as less accomplished and less important, had been living a life she'd never bothered to learn about. The recognition at Mark's ceremony had forced her to confront the possibility that her assessment of our relative worth had been completely wrong. "I want to fix this," she said finally. "I want us to be close again." "I'm not sure we can go back to being close," I said. "Too much has happened, and I've changed too much. But if you want to try building something new, something more equal and respectful, I'm open to that." "What would that look like?" The question told me she genuinely didn't understand what a balanced relationship might involve. "It would mean you being interested in my life the same way you want me to be interested in yours. It would mean respecting my time and boundaries. It would mean recognizing that I have value and accomplishments that exist independently of how useful I am to you. I do recognize that, she said quickly. Last night made you realize that other people recognize it, I interrupted. That's not the same thing as you recognizing it. You're embarrassed because a military officer praised someone you'd publicly dismissed as an embarrassment. You're concerned because people you want to impress were impressed by me. That's about your social standing, not about seeing me clearly. The accusation hung between us, and I could tell it had hit home because she didn't immediately deny it. Maybe that's part of it, she admitted after a long moment. But I've been thinking about what I said at the promotion ceremony, and I know it was wrong. I know I hurt you. You did hurt me, I agreed. But more importantly, you showed me how you really see me. And once I understood that, I had to decide whether I wanted to keep trying to earn respect from someone who'd already decided I wasn't worthy of it. My client meeting was starting in 30 minutes, and I needed to finish getting ready. Isabelle, I have to go. If you want to work on rebuilding some kind of relationship, I'm willing to try. But it has to be different this time. I'm not going back to being the sister whose only value comes from what she can do for you. I want to try, she said. I do. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be a different kind of sister. Start by being interested in who I actually am instead of who you think I should be, I said. Start by respecting my time and choices. Start by treating me like someone whose life and achievements matter, not just someone who's useful when you need help. After we hung up, I finished preparing for my client meeting with a strange mixture of sadness and hope. Sadness for the years we'd lost to an unhealthy dynamic, for the sister relationship that had never quite lived up to its potential. But hope too, hope that Isabelle might be capable of change, that we might be able to build something better from the ruins of what we'd had before. The woman who'd once been dismissed as the family embarrassment was about to find out if her sister was capable of seeing her as anything else. Either way, I'd already learned the most important lesson. My worth wasn't dependent on Isabelle's recognition. I'd found my own strength, built my own life, earned my own respect. Whatever happened between us now, I was no longer the sister who needed her approval to feel valuable. I was the hero who'd saved one of their own, and I'd saved myself in the process. So there you have it. Sometimes the best revenge is simply stepping back and letting people see who you really are. Isabelle learned the hard way that the sister she dismissed as an embarrassment was actually someone worth respecting. Here's what I want to know from you. Have you ever had a family member or close friend who only valued you for what you could do for them? How did you handle it? And for those of you who've been publicly humiliated by someone you trusted, what was your breaking point? Drop your stories in the comments below. I read every single one, and your experiences help others realize they're not alone in dealing with toxic family dynamics. If this story resonated with you, here's what you can do. Hit that like button if you believe in setting boundaries with family. Subscribe for more true stories about standing up for yourself. Share this with someone who needs to hear that their worth isn't determined by how useful they are to others. And remember, you don't have to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop making excuses for people who don't respect you. What boundary do you need to set in your own life? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.